Hey everybody, so I'm sorry this has taken a little bit, but here is the promised test taking strategies conversation that I promised for you. So I'm going to use this as the office hours rumination for the day. So we're just going to go through a few slides here. The slides are going to be available to you in a link below the video, as well as a PDF to one of the slides that you're not going to really be able to see, but I put into the presentation, so it's there for conversation. So as always, if you have any questions, please let me know and we'll just get started. So this shouldn't take too long, but it's going to be longer than some of my other videos. So just make sure you have some time for it. All right, so everything we're going to talk about is based on science. So I want you to know that. Like, first of all, this is not just something that I've made up, but it's something that we've seen demonstrated multiple times across biology, but it's definitely usable in other disciplines as well. And but this is always using, the general statements about courses. None of this stuff applies 100% time to every course, and even some of this may not apply completely to our course. So it's important that you evaluate the material and think about it and have a conversation with your faculty member, whichever class you're talking about. If it's me, definitely let's have a chat about what you're concerned about and where things are going. But definitely this is something that across disciplines should generally help you with test taking. All right, so what are we going to discuss? We're going to talk about exam goals and formatting. So how are exams set up? We're going to talk about something called Bloom's taxonomy, which most of you, unless you have an education background, probably haven't heard of. We're going to talk about some metacognition. It's kind of been a theme for the class. So it's definitely this underlying learn to learn that we've been talking about. We're going to talk about study aids and matching study aids for exam prep, and then we're going to talk about student learning objectives. All right, so first let's talk about exam goals and formatting. Exams are set up for the instructor to generally help assess whether or not students are meeting the student learning outcomes. So student learning outcomes are these things that are designed for the course that the institution, at CWI especially, the institution has decided is what our goals are for that course. And that usually helps with transferability and things like that. It's not something in general that your instructor has made up on the fly or anything like that. Usually these are set across department and even institutionally approved. These student learning outcomes are going to drive the depth and focus of and formatting of exams. And we'll talk about that at the very end of the presentation. But just know that SLOs should be what is guiding your exams setups, and even in-class activities or online activities if you're an online class, quizzes, general activities. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit. All right, so Bloom's taxonomy. This is something that's used in the education field to help move learners from the basic level information, so this knowledge that you see here in red, all the way up to evaluation and synthesis. And this moves you from a lower level of understanding to a higher level of understanding. And so these Bloom's taxonomy help us make sure that we have questions that are that are being asked at the appropriate level that we're looking for. For example, if I'm interested in you being able to analyze a situation or solve a problem, asking you a test that is completely based on knowledge level questions is not going to help me understand whether or not you're meeting your student learning outcomes. So that's where these come in. And this information is going to be really valuable when you start to look at exams. So here is a guide, and this is the one I told you about that'll be a PDF attached to the bottom of the presentation. Here's a guide to help you quickly identify Bloom's questions. Bloom's questions are something that it can take faculty a long time to really understand and have a good grasp of. So I don't expect you tomorrow to become an expert in this. That's why I have this cheat sheet for you. Look for the keywords, this middle section here, on exam questions, and that will help you identify the Bloom's question. So that is, so that's just the starting place. So recognizing that there's these different levels of questions and recognizing that there are ways to easily tell those different levels of questions. So what I want you to do now is I want you to pause the video and go pull one of your most recent tests or quizzes in this class, in another class. It doesn't matter to me, any of them. And look at them and see if you can find what Bloom's level questions you missed. And did you miss all knowledge questions? Did you miss the evaluate synthesis questions? What kind of questions were you missing? And then when you're ready, push play on the presentation again. All right, so here's an important take home from what we just talked about. Tricky questions. So questions that you feel were unfair or or just came out of the blue, generally aren't designed to be tricky questions. Most faculty members aren't out there to, completely confuse students or just, see how much they can torture them on exams. Contrary to popular belief, but it's true. Mainly what it means is you probably haven't prepared for that Bloom's level of a question on that content. So how can we do that? We're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. But first, let's talk about test taking strategies, because most exams are timed. So it's important to be smart about how you move through those Bloom's questions. So once you can acknowledge them, here are some things, or once you can identify what they are, here's how you can use them to be smart when you're in a time situation. So first is that lower level Bloom's, knowledge comprehension. If you get to a question and it's asking you, what is the atmospheric pressure, on a given whatever it is, like there's whatever, but it's asking you about a specific thing that you should have memorized. If you don't know it, don't sit there and try to figure it out. Move on to the next question. If you have time, you can come back at the end, but there is no point in wasting any more time on this question than you absolutely have to read it and realize that you don't have the understanding, because this is not something you can figure out on the fly. Generally, it's something you needed to have known in advance. And then we have these two middle layers. Application is the highest of the low-level concepts or understandings, and analysis is the lowest of the high level. And so they kind of bleed into each other a little bit. But application is applying new concepts to, or applying course concepts to new situations. So let's say we talked about the specific bacteria. And what I've done now is I've asked you to consider this bacterial survival on Mars. Let's just say that that's where we're going to be. And so we, and so you have to have some fundamental information, but you can apply it. What's good about this is you may be able to reason an answer. So, you may be able to think, okay, what do I know about Mars? All right, I can maybe narrow this down to a couple choices here. But once again, you should still always go through the exam and answer the questions you know first. Analysis takes that a little bit one more step farther. So it's asking you to deconstruct some information or apply a concept and take that apart. Once again, you may be able to reason the answer or get partial understanding of the answer, but it requires you to have a deeper understanding of that concept as well. So once again, if you don't have that fundamental information, you're going to need that in order to be able to do these higher level Blooms. And then we have synthesis evaluation questions. These are the questions that 90% of the time I see students not answering on exams because they don't feel like they know it. And you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you have, that you at least attempt them, because at least you're generally going to get partial credit, because evaluation synthesis almost always requires some kind of argument or justification. You're not going to generally see these in multiple choice questions because it's incredibly difficult to write a synthesis evaluation multiple choice question. But so in these essays or things like that, you should be able to put down something for partial credit. And if you're desperate, write down anything you know about the topic. So if the topic is about E. coli on Mars, tell me everything you know about E. coli, tell me everything you know about Mars, and I'll probably give you a couple points. So, so that's some test taking strategies. Always, 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 when you get to the test, first things first, go through every question, identify the ones you know the answers to, come back to the ones you don't. When you're coming back to the ones you don't, that's when you start to prioritize them based on Blooms. So if you come back and you have 6 questions, you have 15 minutes left, find the ones that are analysis application or even synthesis and work on those rather than the knowledge comprehension, because you're going to be putting a lot more effort out during that 1 point for the knowledge comprehension questions than you are going for the payout that you'll likely get from reasoning some answers from application analysis evaluation. All right, so important take home again. When taking an exam, it's important to not just think about the content and answering the questions, but to think about the questions and evaluate your level of understanding. So if you are answering a question that you think should be a knowledge question, but is actually an application because you're keying off some of those words that we talked about on the previous slides, it may change the way you answer that question. So think about that. It requires 2 levels of thought on that. And that's really where you should always use any spare time on an exam, is to really kind of tear apart those questions a little bit. All right, so once again, we've talked about metacognition multiple times in this class. We're doing our Learn to Learn journals. We talked about those Sanford videos. You should always have some metacognition for assessments before and after. So before, here are some questions that you should answer for yourself just before the test or during practice, whatever it is. So take a look at these questions. There's always more that can come up with. You're not limited to these ones, but think about these questions. And then after the exam, the biggest mistake you can make in any class is to not go through your assessment, whether it be the Learn Smart, a quiz, the case study, whatever it is that you're doing in the class. Even if it's worth 2 points, the biggest mistake you can make is to not go through it and ask these questions about it. If you did 100%, great. These questions are going to take you really not very much time to go through. If you didn't, this is the place where you can identify what you're missing. Because even if you're not going to see those kind of questions again, if you don't have a comprehensive final or something, by not understanding something here, you may A, not be able to understand the concept later, or B, you might be making some kind of systematic flaw in how you're preparing for this type of content that you're going to perpetuate across the new content that you're going to learn. So it's important to understand that. All right, so I want you to pause the video again, and I want you to go back to the last 2 slides and answer 3 to 5 questions on each of them, and then unpause the video and come back. All right, so here's an important take home on assessments. Every assessment in the course, as I mentioned just a minute ago, should be reviewed and reflected upon using metacognitive questions. You cannot over-review your past assessments. All right, so let's move into study aids. So study aids, everybody has them. Flashcards, note-taking, drawing pictures. I was a huge one of typing up my handwritten notes for class. There's all sorts of different study aids. So you have, and there's nothing wrong with, there's always personalized versions of them. So you identify what was working for you. So I want you to take a moment now and write down your favorite study aids. What are you using in class? Are you using flashcards exclusively? Are you drawing pictures? Are you practicing math problems? Whatever it is. And when you're done, hit play again and we'll resume. All right, so now that you have that list, let's talk about how study aids and blooms come together. So study aids can help you reach the different levels of blooms, okay? So if you look here, you can see that if you are a primary flashcard user, which I know a lot of you are because we've talked about it in class, you're going to find it right here. So flashcards are a knowledge level question, which means that when you get to a quiz and there's an analysis question, you're not going to be prepared for those kind of questions. You won't have practiced them. You may be able to do it on the fly because of the different levels of questions or your level of comfort with it, but you haven't practiced for it. So in fact, you haven't really studied for those level of questions. The Learn Smart Book activities are almost always knowledge comprehension. So it really helps with fundamental information, but if you are not practicing the application, you may struggle with that in a time situation. So for example, if we're talking about the cell wall and you have memorized or you don't understand what the phospholipid bilayer is, okay, well that's a knowledge thing, that's a flashcard thing that you need to understand. And if you don't understand, you're definitely not going to be able to answer this question about an analysis of the cell wall with the phospholipid bilayer. But if you only memorize what the phospholipid bilayer is, you may not be able to practice or be able to answer analysis or application questions about that. Okay? So it's important that you are scaffolding and doing a variety of preparation and activities. And there's examples here. These are not all of them. The micro book is really great at providing some practice questions in the back of each chapter, but almost all textbooks have some levels of these questions in the back of the chapter. Do not ignore those questions at the back of the chapter. It's important that you look at them because they're there for a reason to help you out. This next slide is study group ideas. So you can obviously take these and turn them into individual, and the same thing goes for the individuals. You can take them and make them study groups. But these are, once again, things you could be doing in your study group to work together. So, important take home from that is by limiting your study aids, you may be limiting your performance. If you are only doing flashcards, you are not studying for each type of Bloom's level question, and you are likely to see multiple levels of Bloom's on an exam. So make sure that you're doing multiple different types of study aids. All right, so you wrote down that list a little bit ago. What I want you to do now is pause the video, match up your study aids to the Bloom's level questions, and see how you're doing. Are you preparing in such a way that the quizzes, tests, etc. are going to be easier or not? And when you're done, hit play again. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about is using student learning outcomes to predict test format. So student learning outcomes at CWI are in all of our course syllabi. You'll see them in the class in various ways. They're also sometimes shared in study guides, unit objectives, any number of formats. And at minimum, even if your professor is not providing them, you'll see some in textbooks as well. If in doubt, have a conversation with your faculty member. That's what they're there to have these conversations about. So by having this information, you almost have the keys to the kingdom. So for example, here are 2 student learning outcomes. The first is identify and explain the key groups of microbial organisms and discuss the impact of these groups on human health. All right, so there's actually kind of 2 SLOs in here. The first is identify and explain the key groups of microbial organisms. All right, so pause the video, go back to that slide with the keywords or blooms, find identify. When you're ready, hit play. And hopefully what you have now found is that identify is a knowledge-based question. So now that you know that, what type of study aid should you be using to address this student learning outcome? And if you're saying flashcards or something like that, you're right. That is exactly how you should prepare for this. So in this situation, being able to identify and explain the key groups of microbial organisms, and don't forget explain, you're going to need to look up where that one falls in too. But if it was just identify the key groups of microbial organisms, preparing for a synthesis level question is not likely, right? Because the student learning outcome for that assessment is identify. So that's where the note cards would be a valuable tool. Now this next one, evaluate various uses of microbes in human health as well as critically analyze current or contemporary claims of microbial uses. All right, that one's a big one, right? What tells you right away what the Bloom's level should be falling at. Evaluate. Okay, so this is one of those ones where you're going to want to prepare for those upper level Bloom's questions. This is where you're going to find an essay question on the test. This is where you're going to find other things like that. In fact, to an extent, depending on how your class is set up, you may not see this type of question on the exam. For example, in the micro class, we are using these generally in case studies. So this is where you're going to see that kind of level come in because it's going to be outside of a testing format. So recognizing some of these things and understanding that it all flows with the course material, the assessment strategies of the course, things like that. But you have some hints as to where you're going, even without a study guide. All right, so find some unit SLOs, whether it be from this class, whether it be from any other class, and see if you can match some Bloom's level and if you can guess as to what the exam or if these Bloom's or if these student learning outcomes are going to be on the exam. When you're ready, hit play again. All right, so here's the important take home. Your professor has a variety of tools available to help you prepare for assessments, even if they don't tell you that. Even if they don't say their study guides or they don't say that, you, especially a CWI student, has access to SLOs for every course. And so that is the best study guide you have, and everything should be built off of those. All right, so let's wrap this up. First is metacognition is the key. You got to check in as you're learning, you got to check in as you're studying, and you got to check in during the exams or during the assessment. Don't check out of that, and afterwards too. So you should be talking to yourself about how you're learning and how you're understanding things in a variety of places. This is one of those places where a growth mindset is key. So if you're finding that you're not understanding X, always put the yet on the end, just like like the Sanford videos talked about. It's always, I don't understand X yet, and keep working on it. Okay, there is nothing that you can't learn if you don't put your mind to it. Don't waste time on knowledge comprehension test questions in an exam format. If you don't know the answer, don't get stuck there. Move on, get the points you can. Only come back to these level of questions at the very end if you have time. When taking an exam, this is always the order you should operate in. You should read all the questions. Make sure you understand whether or not you're in a situation where you can backtrack. If an instructor set it up so you can't, you're going to just have to move forward in the way you can. But read all the questions. Identify the questions you don't know immediately. Circle them, write down the number, whatever it is. Answer the questions you do know the answer to. And then come back to the ones you didn't know the answer to and prioritize based on Bloom's. Start with the ones you have a shot at being able to reason out or understand, moving towards the ones that it's just going to have to be whether or not you can jog your memory or not. Make sure you exam prep for all Bloom's levels. Don't just get stuck on knowledge comprehension because then you're going to be unprepared for any analysis application type questions. And then use your student learning outcomes to help you predict exam format. So as I said, all of these, all this information is a generic information that can be applied to a variety of classes, but every class is unique. And so some of this may not even completely work for you in this class, but it's important that you understand these generic things so that you can work through some of this exam prep and help you get better. But always, 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 the biggest key, if you're not happy with your progression in the course, see your faculty member. Come see me in my office hours, virtual office hours, whatever we need to do. Come see me so we can talk through it. We will work through each question, identify how to prepare better for those kind of questions in the future. And this is the end of this little chat. I did not go through the learning objectives from this week because of this presentation for office hours. So make sure you're checking on your Learn Smart objectives and identifying what you're not understanding so you can work on those more. All right, as always, if you have any questions, you know where to find me. Bye.